Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing my April wrap-up. If you watched my May TBR, you probably already know that my reading in April didn't really go as planned. I did not get through a lot of what I wanted to, which honestly, that should be totally fine. I mean, reading is for fun. It's a hobby. It's not like I'm obligated to read, so I wouldn't really mind that much except for the fact where I don't think I had a super productive month in other ways. I feel like the last few weeks were just a little unproductive in general, and I probably spent too much time, playing solitaire or something instead of reading. So let's do some stats anyway. I did read 11 books, which sounds all right, except that 3 of them were novellas, so that actually went by pretty quickly. And then I also read one that was nonfiction that was also super, super short, although I don't think nonfiction technically, I mean, it is not fiction, so it can't be a novella, but it was definitely like novella length nonfiction. Then breakdown by genre, other than the nonfiction, I read 2 science fiction books and 8 fantasy. So again, this is pretty standard for me. And I listened to 4 audiobooks, which is pretty high, but 3 of those were the novellas. And then I read 2 books physically, and then the rest, does my math add up? I think it does. The other 5 of those were ebooks. There are also a few books that I carried over from April into May. I talked about those already in my May TBR, so I'm not going to recap them now. But if there's something you expected to see me talk about here that I don't talk about, probably it's in the May TBR. Usually when I do my wrap-ups, I rank the books from least favorite to most favorite, which I'm still gonna do, but this was actually kind of a funny month that way. I didn't really read anything that I really disliked. I basically liked everything, and there also wasn't anything that I really loved. So while I have sort of a rough ranking order here, honestly, I feel like everything was pretty, from pretty fine to basically good. Probably my least favorite book that I read this month was The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. This is something that my husband and I read for a professional nonfiction book club that we've been doing, nothing to do with the channel. And it's an interesting book. It's aimed at artists, specifically writers, but really any artist. It's about resistance and how that affects people, but I don't even know how to summarize this anymore since it's been a few weeks since I read it. But basically it's one person's very subjective opinion, which we read coming off reading something the previous month that was very scientific. And it did make for a good discussion because a lot of people kind of had violent reactions to this book one way or another. I think I did too. There are parts of it that are valuable, but there are also things in there that just made me kind of mad. So after that, probably the book I enjoyed the least, and I'm saying the least, but I did still enjoy this book, that was Ruin by Gwynne. This is book 3 of The Faithful and the Fallen that I finally got to after a lot of procrastination. And I really like Gwynne's writing. He writes action really well. He writes characters that I really care about in general, even though a lot of the book, I feel like 80% of his books are just fighting, but it's enjoyable fighting. I would be really happy if that percentage was just like 15% less. Like if it was like 65% fighting, I think that would be great. But I really enjoy his writing overall. This book just had one huge problem for me that this isn't even the author's fault. I just couldn't get past it. I mentioned this a little bit in my review of Malice. So basically in this series, there are, let's basically call them like good angels and bad angels. And the bad angels are called kadoshim, which means holy or holy ones, basically in Hebrew. So basically the whole time I'm reading the book, and now in book 3, they are playing a more prominent role in the action, so I'm reading that word a lot, and it's just kind of being used in a context that not only doesn't quite make sense, but is like actually the opposite of what the word means. I don't have any kind of like moral problem with the author choosing to use this word. It's just incredibly distracting if it's a word or when there's something in a language that you're familiar with that doesn't make sense in the way it's being used. It just really pulls you out of the story. It's like if you were reading Lord of the Rings and like the orcs or the Nazgul were like unironically called angels or something like that. It's just, you'd just be like, what? like every time you come across the word. So I just could never quite get over that, and it just drove me a little bit insane. Like I said, I don't think this is a flaw in the writing. I do think it's probably better as an author to avoid using words in foreign languages in ways that don't really make sense. I mean, I think he just didn't think about how it would read to somebody that sort of was more familiar with the language. Like, I don't think anything bad was meant by it. Like, I could see someone be like, oh, it's kind of cool to take this thing that means holy and then make it the bad guys. Like, cool. And that's fine. It's gonna be a slog through book 4 just because of that. Because every time I read it, it just distracts me. Other than that, this book had some great moments. There were some really good like stand up and cheer moments for different characters, and then it ended on like a horrible cliffhanger. So yeah. Next, I'll talk about The Hallowed Hunt by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is a little bit confusing to talk about because I actually read this book because of some novellas that I'll talk about a little bit later, but I'll just talk about this one on its own first. This is book 3 kind of in her series. It's the Curse of Chalia and Paladin of Souls, and then The Hallowed Hunt. It's set basically in the same universe, but it's in a different country and hundreds of years earlier than the other 2 books, so it's basically a standalone. This is a book that I had maybe tried to start a few years back and just didn't quite get into, but because of the Penric novellas that I was reading, I got sort of more interested in the setting and the characters of this book in particular, and thought, you know what, I'm gonna go back, and I listened to it on audiobook, and I love Lois McMaster Bujold. She's one of my favorite authors, but this book was kind of a struggle. And actually, credit to her as a writer, I got pretty into it by the end anyway, because her story and concepts kind of got really interesting. But basically, this book just has an unlikable protagonist compared to her usual protagonists, who tend to be quite, I guess I would say, witty and likable. The main character of The Hallowed Hunt, Ingray, he's almost like he's been through some rough stuff, but the character is sort of a like silent, kind of a hired thug almost type character. And he definitely grows beyond that, and it's explored and stuff like that, but he's just not a very likable person. And then the female lead character is also kind of fine, not that likable, kind of generic. So just the charm of the characters just wasn't there, and the pacing of the book is pretty odd. What kind of saved most of it is there are some incredible, hilarious side characters and things like that I just adored. And then the final, like the climactic parts of the plot got pretty interesting. But overall, just I wouldn't really recommend this book, even if you liked the first 2 books in the series. I think it's probably a skip. Then I read Behind the Throne by K.B. Wagers. I'm still not sure if I'm saying the author's name correctly. This was a Magic Hat pick. It was a recommendation from a subscriber. This is a book I'm really happy I read, because I just never would have even heard of this series or this author if it hadn't been for the recommendation. This was just a really fun sort of science fiction space opera political adventure, basically. This book really reminded me of some of the space operas that a really good friend of mine that I grew up with would lend me when we were teenagers. We both really loved genre fiction, and we always shared books, but he was a lot more into science fiction and I was a lot more into fantasy. So there's a lot of science fiction that I read because of him, and just reading this, it was almost nostalgic, because this, I don't know if he would like it today, but it just struck me as something exactly like what this friend would have been, sharing with me. And so I guess overall, just as sort of a fun science fiction story, it hit a really fun note. The main character is a princess who ran away and was a gun runner for a couple of decades, and then now has had to sort of go back and become the heir. I like having an older female lead and a not heavily romantic at all plot, and the political thriller kind of stuff. It was a fun book. The next book I'll talk about is Sufficiently Advanced Magic by Andrew Rowe. This was also a Magic Hat pick for me, but I think from back in February. It took me a while to actually finish this book. Once I did, I really enjoyed it. I actually have a review for this that I filmed and just haven't edited yet. So I guess I will leave talking about this book for when I actually post that review. This book is sort of a hybrid of lit RPG and traditional fantasy. And for me, the video game elements were maybe a little too strong because I'm not that much of a gamer, but it was still a fun book with likable characters, and I definitely enjoyed reading it. Pretty early in the month, I finished The Dragon Reborn. Did I grab the right book off the shelf? Yeah, I did. Okay, book 3 in the Wheel of Time. So I was probably supposed to finish that in March. I'm basically at least a month behind on the Wheel of Time at all times. I powered through this one. I really liked the beginning. I sort of lost steam by the end. But I have this weird, now that it's been a few weeks, I have this weird reaction to Wheel of Time where whenever I finish each book, I feel kind of burned out and like I didn't enjoy it as much as I should have. And then I feel like weirdly excited to get to the next book, but then I also procrastinate on getting to the next book. So it's kind of a strange loop here. I'm overall enjoying the series. The Dragon Reborn is the first book where we've gotten a lot more focus on other characters, and a lot of new characters get introduced, and you sort of see more how the series is going to take shape, which honestly, my biggest problem with this book is that by the end, I felt like the first 3 books of the Wheel of Time had been kind of a 3-book introduction to the series, and I'm not sure how I feel about that yet. But overall, I had, I think, a good time reading this. You'd have to go back and watch my vlog. I have both a spoiler-free discussion review video and also a spoiler-filled vlog that I filmed while reading The Dragon Reborn. That's what I've been doing for each Wheel of Time book. So you can check those videos out if you want to see more Wheel of Time stuff from me. A book that I really enjoyed this month, or last month, a book that I really enjoyed in April was The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. This is the 4th and final book in the Wayfarers series, although each book in the series stands alone. I also have a review up for this one. I read it as an advanced reader copy, although I think I basically read it either the day it came out or maybe the day before it came out, something like that. This is a really nice, cozy story with a lot of just, character stuff. If you've read any of the Wayfarers books, you know none of them have a plot. This was no exception. If you really like cozy science fiction without a plot, I recommend starting with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet first. And if you like that one, I think The Galaxy and the Ground Within was probably, I liked it as much as the first one. Book 2 in the series is still probably my favorite because it has the most plot, I think. I'm probably more of a character reader than a plot reader, but it really just depends on the book for me. I can like anything. I also decided to start The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham last month, and I read the first book, A Shadow in Summer, which is pretty short, really like 200 something pages. Weirdly, when I read the prologue, I had this sense that I had read it before, but I think only just the prologue, and I have no idea how long ago. So I guess I had tried to read that book before. I think it's a book that I wouldn't have liked that much when I was younger, but I really, really enjoyed it now. It is not a typical fantasy book at all. It's kind of slow for a 200-page fantasy book. There's just a lot of unusual ideas, a lot of world building. I don't quite know how to feel about it yet, other than that it really intrigued me. So once I read the whole series, whenever that is, maybe I'll do like a series review. I didn't quite feel compelled to do an individual review. But the fundamental concept for the series seems to be there are these beings called the Andot or Andot, I don't know. They're basically ideas turned into beings, and they are created and then bound by these poets. I wish I could explain what A Shadow in Summer is about more right now, but it just feels like way too much for a wrap-up video because every time I start thinking about what I'm going to say, it just goes off in a direction that is too much information. So go look up a synopsis. But if you're in the mood for a little bit more of a literary idea-based fantasy that's kind of slow and character exploratory, maybe you'd enjoy it. Probably my favorite thing that I read this month was 3 novellas by Lois McMaster Bujold, the first 3 in the Penric and Desdemona series. The first one, Penric's Demon, was a hat suggestion from a viewer, and I really enjoyed it, and it was short, so I went on to read the next 2 in the series. I listened to all of these on audiobook, and it was a little weird because it's the same narrator as the Miles Vorkosigan series. Again, I'll probably do like a series review of these at some point, or maybe I could even do a review of the first three. I love Lois McMaster Bujold. Most of her books just really do it for me. Penric is a really charming main character. He's different from Miles, but he's just, honestly, he's just a sweet, scholarly, kind of naive guy who accidentally ends up with a demon. And in this world, people who have a demon inside of them become sorcerers, but they're kind of in this almost like symbiotic relationship with the demon. I don't know, the stories, they tend to have a little bit of a mystery flavor to them, but also just the characters are really fun. I can't see anyone who has liked other books by Bujold not really liking this series. I'm usually not a huge novella person, but these really worked for me. Each one almost, I felt like a mini Bujold book. Like I could sort of still, I could recognize her structure and her writing, and it just, didn't take as long. So, I mean, duh, but that worked for me. I don't always like novellas, but I'm really, really enjoying these. And there's a few more of them out. It's a longer series, so I'm looking forward to reading the rest of them. That's it for the books I read this month. I am pretty terrible at outros, but if you made it this far, I assume you maybe like watching me, so maybe like the video and subscribe so you can watch more.